and welcome to our UCL ISR series of lectures today. I'm Raymond Bleischwitz, PhD Bulletin Chair for Sustainable Global Resources here at the UCL ISR. Pleased to meet you. Before we start with our speaker and the topic, I have to share some housekeeping rules with you. I've heard that today this room not only has changed, but also is subject to an experiment, which shouldn't make you nervous. It's kind of a physical experiment, and we are expected not to change the temperature and not to open the windows here. But if I realize that anybody feels extremely inconvenient, starts to suffer, including our distinguished speaker, I will probably break the rule and finish the experiment. But I guess it's more or less fine with most of you, just to make you aware that this is part of the story today. The topic today is the role of mining in contributing to sustainable development through the value chain. And indeed, you could think of a number of varieties what this contribution could be. Well, think about the great history of UK, where the whole industrialization started with mining. And there are other countries where we could also trace the history back to the origin of industrialization due to mining. And there are great hopes around the world that this might happen these days for a number of other countries. On the other side, there is also the impact that mining has, undoubtedly, on the environment, relocating some local people, and this indeed is also part of the story where I would think this is a more negative contribution to sustainable development. So there is a great deal to discuss and to analyze, and one of the core concepts in that regard is responsibility. How can actors, how can mining corporations contribute to a shared responsibility? And I heard this is at the heart of your contribution, of your presentation today. The speaker today, Davies, is probably, well, one of the best persons to talk about those things. You're a trained physicist, you have a PhD in mining and metals, and you've been at the International Council for Mining and Metals for around about 10 years now.
Yeah.
In charge with the Materials Stewardship Initiative, represent ICMM on a number of occasions in international organizations. So this means you have a great share of experience with the issue, and we look forward to your speech.
Good. Thank you very much, Raymond. Good evening to everybody, and thanks for the invitation, thanks for the opportunity. I hope, maybe it just means I haven't been found out so far, so we'll see how it goes tonight. But I should also dispel any worries that anybody has. I know there's a vital football match going on later, and don't worry, I'm not going to drone on for so long that you'll miss the football. But in a nod to the beautiful game, what I've decided to do is actually make this a talk of two halves. I'm firstly going to just talk a little bit about ICMM and focus on the work that we do, where ICMM came from, why it was formed, what the sort of pressures that it was formed to react to, and give you sort of my sense of how that's going, how effective it's been over the past decade or so, just over a decade now since it was formed. And then I'd like to move on to talk a little bit about the work that I do within ICMM on more the value chain, so not looking so much at the mining side of the world, but looking more at the materials, how they flow through the value chain into products, into the things that we use every day, and hopefully at some stage flow back out of those into the system again. So I'll just look a little bit about the work that we're doing to see what's really the role of mining companies in that whole picture. Mining companies are at a particular place in a value chain, which is often thought of as a sort of standard linear value chain, but is this really the way we should be looking at it, and is there a way that we can encourage companies and work with companies, particularly at the mining end of the sector, to make sure that they're also getting maximum value out of the materials that are being used? So those are the things I'd like to cover. I think very briefly, these are the contents of my presentation, so you can hold me to this at the end if you think I've missed anything out or skipped over anything too quickly. But I'll move in first to discussing ICMM itself. ICMM was the International Council on Mining and Metals, formed in 2001, but really has its origins a little bit further back than that, probably in the early to mid 1990s. where there was a problem emerged over a real disconnect between societal expectations of the mining industry and the way that the industry was in fact performing in reality. And I think this was really coming to a head in the mid-1990s. Several of the big investment houses were beginning to think, are the mining industries really industries that they can support in the long term, given the sort of risks that were around environmental challenges, social challenges, and they're really worried about that aspect. It was also the same time that the whole concept of sustainable development was being framed. So we'd had the Rio Earth Summit, later on there'd be the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, and there was an awful lot of evolution of the concept of sustainable development at that time as well. So it was interesting that there was a sort of confluence of two streams of thinking, really. And ICMM has its genesis in a meeting of around about 6 company CEOs who got together in the corners at Davos at the World Economic Forum and realised they really needed to do something about this. And having seen the sort of the way that society was embracing the concept of sustainable development, how could they figure out what that meant for the mining industry, and what does sustainable development mean for an industry that exploits a non-renewable resource? I mean, it's almost an oxymoron to some people. Can it be sustainable? But they really need to know, what did that mean? What were the expectations of them as mining companies? What was their part in society, and how could they transition towards more responsible practices that would give them a better standing in the communities where they were operating? So those 6 CEOs commissioned the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED, to carry out a project that took a few years from 1998 right through to 2001, which known as the Global Mining Initiative, which looked at all of those things. There was a big review of practices of the industry, of expectations. So it was a huge multi-stakeholder process, and throughout that process it grew to around about 25 companies supporting it. As I say, run independently by IIED, involving tens of thousands of stakeholders in the end, within the total collaboration around the world, hundreds of workshops. And the output of that was a report called Breaking New Ground, the MMSD report, Minerals Mining Sustainable Development Report, which was launched at a conference in Toronto back in 2001. And ICMM was essentially set up to take forward the recommendations of that report. So that report it details all the challenges in respect to sustainable development for the industry at that time as they were understood. And there's a series of recommendations in there as to what the industry should be doing to solve the problems that it had at that time. And ICMM was set up to really take that forward, to work with the companies, to be a platform for them to work collaboratively, but also to engage with the leading experts in the fields of the social sciences, environmental sciences, and as we'll hear a little bit later, looking at things like supply chains and resource efficiency. So that's very briefly where ICMM came from and the history of what it was set up to do. Today we are 22 companies. We're led by the company CEOs, which is quite a nice thing to see. Twice a year the CEOs of our member companies come together to discuss our direction, what our priorities should be. They operate around about 800 sites in 62 countries around the world. So we have in our membership many of the major and the biggest multinational mining companies. And I'll show you who they are in just a second. We also have 34 association members. And again, I'll come back to them and talk about them in a little bit more detail in a second, because that's quite an important part of our membership. These are our member companies. You can see a lot of the major companies are there. And a reasonable geographic spread of them. These are simply where their headquarters are located, but obviously they're operating, as I said, over 60 countries around the world. There's perhaps we're underrepresented in some regions. China, India, and Russia are probably the reasons where we don't have good representation at the moment. We do work with other stakeholders in those regions, but we don't have companies based there. And then we have our member associations. And now these associations are, as you can see, either national or regional mining associations, so they'll be associations of companies operating within those countries, in those regions, or they are metals commodity associations, and they tend to be primarily focused on research around the metals that they're producing, maybe environmental research, human health research, those kind of things. So they bring us a lot of expertise. So the role of the associations is very important, actually. It's quite significant within ICMM, and particularly when we start to think about the materials and the value chains. There's a bit of a dual role in many respects. So we rely heavily on these associations for intelligence. So the national associations will know what's happening in countries, what are the hot spots, what are the issues that we should really be facing, and bring things to ICMM. And the commodity associations as well. value the scientific input we get from them greatly. There's some real experts on the metals. That's where they're sitting. The people perhaps who know the most about the properties of the materials and the markets, how they're being used. But we also, when ICMM was set up, there was a conscious decision to keep it to being a relatively small group of member companies. When I began 10 years ago, I think it was 14 companies. It's grown slowly to 22. But there was a conscious decision early on that there would be a small group of the leading companies to try and make progress more quickly. But it's that real challenge between taking the whole sector with you while you're trying to make progress as a small group of companies. And that's been the dual challenge for ICMM over the years, is how do you try to improve the reputation of a whole sector while just working with some of the leading companies. And the associations are actually a big part in doing that for us, because through these we reach out to probably around 1,500 to 2,000 other companies, so medium to small scale mining operations to one man and his dog mining operations in some cases. So we have a lot of reach. So everything that ICMM develops, and I'll go on to show what that is in a moment, is made freely available, and this is a way that we can disseminate it around the world. And it gives us a much greater reach than perhaps you'd think from just the member companies that we have. So the other thing that the thing that sort of makes ICMM slightly different to many member associations, and that differentiates it, we would hope, is that there are standards and there are performance expectations of members. So for companies, it's not a case that you could come along, pay your membership fee and be an ICMM member. There's more than that expected of you. So at the heart of this is what we call our sustainable development framework, and there are three elements to it essentially: principles, a reporting commitment, and a third-party assurance commitment as well. So we have 10 principles for sustainable development. These were drawn from that MMSD report that I mentioned earlier, and touch on all of the elements that you would expect to be in there. I'll show you what they are in a moment. And along with those 10 principles, we also have a number of specific commitments to issues where we felt there was a need for perhaps stronger commitment or more direct commitment on a particular issue. So again, you'll see what those are in a second. But every year our companies are now, the expectation is that these principles, and the commitments within those position statements are embedded into the corporate policies of our companies and embedded into the ways that they operate. And on an annual basis, our companies are expected to report on their progress in implementing those principles. So this is done through the Global Reporting Initiative, and you'll see if you look at the sustainability reports of our member companies, they're geared up to report using GRI against the ICMM principles, position statements, and the indicators of the GRI. So GRI has a set of core sustainability indicators, also has now a set of sector-specific indicators that were developed by ICMM, by the GRI, and by other stakeholders in consultation back in the early days of ICMM. So that's set up. These sustainability reports are then assured by a third party to make sure that the declarations in them are accurate. There's a true picture of the way that the companies are implementing these principles. So this is designed to make sure that there's a commitment for member companies of joining, and that there is alignment between companies in the way that they're heading. So I think there's a sort of natural progression. I think, having seen ICMM operating over time, the first stage was really to get alignment in high-level corporate principles, corporate policies, and I think we're beginning to see this sort of trickle down more to the operational factors within the companies, and increasingly we're seeing at the assurance level, the reporting and assurance level, these principles and the systems being assured more at the site level, not just within the corporate reports of the companies. So that's what we hope sort of differentiates ICMM from some of the other member associations. That's the way we work and the way that our members are demonstrating their commitment. Just very quickly, these are the principles that I mentioned a moment ago. These are a real précis of what they are. If you go to the ICMM website, you can see the full version. And beneath each of these, there are numbers of sub-points and elements that companies are expected to adhere to and point them towards greater detail. But they probably cover most of the things that you would expect to see in a sustainable development framework for the mining industry. So social, human rights issues, health, safety, environment. And in the case of Principle 8, which is the one that sort of my work responds to largely, commitment to work with others through the supply chain. And this is encouraging sort of responsible use, reuse, recycling, and disposal of the products that we create. And on the right-hand side here, you can see the 6 position statements that we currently have. So companies have made very specific commitments on a number of topics here. that they're held to account for. So our work, well, the work that ICMM does on a daily basis is really aimed at supporting our members in implementing that framework, making sure that they have the sort of tools, the guidance they need to demonstrate that they're taking these things into account in their systems and in the way that they're operating. So we have a secretariat of 25 people now based here in London, organised into 4 substantive work programmes with a communication support and a strategy team as well. The 4 areas you can see here in the squares, let me just briefly sort of give you a feel for what they do, and then I'm going to, for the rest of the time, focus more on the materials side of things, materials stewardship. But our social and economic development programme is a programme that looks at the factors really that Raymond covered in his introduction. The fact that mining can be a tremendous driver for development, a tremendous source of development in some countries, but we don't always see that being the case. Some countries that are incredibly minerals rich actually don't see that translated into economic prosperity through mining. This program's spent a lot of time looking at the factors behind that. What are really the challenges? What's missing in those countries where you don't see the success stories compared to those that do? And not surprisingly, a lot of this comes down to governance, elements of governance, the way that the industry is regulated, the way and the environment it operates under. That's really moving now into the territory of looking at how can we create partnerships between industry, between government, between other stakeholders to address some of those capacity gaps, particularly in governance, to make sure that minerals endowments are really transferred across into to economic prosperity the way it should be in countries. So that's a lot of the focus of that programme. There's also work going on in there in that programme on community engagement, how do companies best engage communities, particularly on some of the difficult issues they face, some of the conflict that takes place around mining, and his work on other aspects of human rights and indigenous peoples that we issue guidance on. I should say most of this work that we do is not done alone, so we're not sort of working in the office in London and pushing this stuff out to our companies and telling them this is how to do it. Wherever we can, we're engaging with the leading thinkers in the world on this. So you'll see us engaging with the big multilateral industries, with leading academics, with companies, with stakeholders, with community groups. We find that whatever we do, it's going to be much more credible if we can engage with others in developing it. So that's the real mode that ICMM's operating on at the moment. Our other programmes, environment and climate change, is focusing, as you would imagine, on the sort of key environmental issues around mining sites. Water is one of the big priorities for that group at the moment, particularly conflict around water use in mining is growing. Stress around supply of water for mines is a big issue. Water quality, a lot of aspects of water that are really pretty priority issues at the moment, and that group's working with some of the big NGOs to look at strategies for companies to alleviate some of those problems. They've recently developed and released a water stewardship framework that our companies will be operating within. So that's one of the big issues. Climate change is another issue that the group's facing. How can mining industries perhaps use some of the endowments that they have? I mean, the mining industry owns a lot of land. How can we maybe look at adaptation to climate change? How can we look at other issues within our sites, reducing energy intensities, those sort of issues? What does that really mean for us at the site level, very much again? And biodiversity is the other big issue that our environment programme deals with. So how do we assess biodiversity? How do we look at loss of biodiversity? How can we look at issues like offsetting? Are there ways, best practice in ways of doing this? And again, we work with the big NGOs. We work with the bodies like IUCN on those sort of issues to make sure that we're working with the leading experts where we can. On health and safety, there's been a big push on safety in the mining industry over the last decade. Fatalities have been a big problem for the industry for a long time, and there's been a huge improvement in the number of fatalities. It's dropped quite dramatically over the last decade, but it's plateaued, and the mining industry is still killing people. That's a reality. So there's work still to be done there, and we're looking at these issues. What are the best practices in terms of contractor management, in terms of vehicle safety at sites? Some of the big issues, the hotspots that are still left around safety in mining, and also beginning to look a little bit at community health issues. Some of the issues around worker health issues, perhaps with processes on site, diesel particulates. Some of the things that are becoming issues for health and safety in mining companies. And finally, there's the materials stewardship programme, which is where I work. And this has a slightly different flavour to the other three, in that the other three are focused very much on mine site issues or countries, regions where there are mining operations. Within the Materials Stewardship Programme, our point of entry into the whole debate around sustainable development is the material itself. How can we make sure that the material's being produced efficiently, responsibly? What can we do to then make sure that goes on to be used in the best possible way and risks minimised along the supply chain? So these are the sort of outputs you'll see from ICMM. As I say, everything we produce is freely available. You can go to our website and download these documents. Very often we keep hard copies. If you send me an email, I can send you any that you're interested in. The reason this is obviously produced for our members, but it's freely available on the expectation that others within the sector will be able to use it, particularly good practice guidance and policies. I think it's important that that's available to the whole sector, not just the ICMM members. I guess the final comment to make on ICMM would be, well, is it working? Is this association that was set up to improve practice within the industry, is it having an effect? Is it improving practices? And it's difficult. It's very difficult to measure at times. But from the studies we've done, the studies that others have done, I think there does seem to be a real improvement in performance, particularly in the leading companies, and particularly those companies we're working with. Perception studies of the industry are actually reasonably positive over the last 10 years. We've carried out studies ourselves every 3 or 4 years, and others are doing the same thing. And you can actually see that the perception of the industry and the way that it's tackling those difficult challenges has improved dramatically. It's gone from probably being the worst performer, certainly in the extractives industry, to being probably the top performer by perception. So there are definitely improvements. There's no doubt practices have improved. There's no doubt that the industry is moving in the right direction in that respect. At the same time, there is also a rise in conflict. We're seeing an almost exponential increase in tension and conflict around mining operations. So something still isn't working in that respect, and there's certainly further work to be done on many of these areas. But I think we can be confident that this is the commitment that the leading companies are making, the practices that are being put into place are working. I think when we go back to look at some of the communities that caused ICMM's formation in the first place, the sort of socially responsible investors, there's been a real change in the way that they're regarding the industry at the moment. I talk about the industry, it's the good companies. I think that's one thing that's very evident, is that there's a real spread, there's a spectrum of performance across the industry. But there is, at the top end, there's certainly a marked improvement in performance, and we're getting that feedback from, as I say, from the investment communities, from others outside. So it's positive, but there is obviously a lot of work still to be done. And ICMM still has a very active work programme. We've got a lot of commitment still from our companies to keep increasing the work we're doing in that agenda. So the aspect that I want to focus on for the second half here is really on to talk about the materials a little bit more, not so much the effect that mining has in the country of production, or the impacts, the benefits around production and production sites, but to talk a little bit more about materials. The other impacts, we know they're very real, and of course they are associated with that material in some way, and in many respects that's the big challenge that we're seeing now, and I'll come back to that sort of concept in a moment. How do we in some way to carry that footprint of the burdens, the impacts at the mining side with the material? So when we're improving those processes, how is that reflected in the material that somebody's buying? It's a very difficult thing to do. It's a very difficult question to answer, but this is the sort of work that we are undertaking. That's the challenge that we're trying to undertake within the Materials Stewardship programme. I'll leave these quotes behind me for a few seconds. It's not a new question. From the very beginning of the concept of sustainable development, it's been a recognition that where you have in extractive industries producing materials, then those materials have a real part to play in the transition towards sustainability. And it's the final one that really resonates with me quite a bit, having worked in the industry now for a while. That looks at this connection, or the lack of connection between the companies that are producing the commodities and then the people who are using them, and the materials, the products that are used in society. And that's one of the big challenges for us to grapple with. And what sort of activities can a mining company engage in that have an effect through the value chain? So over the past decade, we've certainly seen, I think, the industry become less vertically integrated. So there are fewer companies that are mining and then following the process right through to producing products at the end. So fewer companies that they're able to influence every step along the value chain. So we've got to find a way to come up with some sort of framework that we can use, something that gets activities and intentions aligned right through the value chain. And that's what we're hoping to do through our materials stewardship program. And I'd going to talk a little bit about the terminology in a way, materials stewardship. Why not circular economy? Why not extended producer responsibility, or one of the other terms that is around? And they're all reasonably aligned, I think, in what we're trying to do. And this goes back to some of the really early work that was done at ICMM, and some work that was commissioned to look at the eco-efficiency of materials. So what was really the balance between the economic and environmental benefits that were coming from materials, and then the burdens that were associated at the same time with producing those materials. And through looking at that, you could begin to see where the real value in a material lies. And through looking where the value is, you could then look at what actually are the appropriate management strategies for a particular material. A very simple concept, a highly simplified concept, but something that's led us in an interesting direction. And this is really where our work was founded. So this comes from a study that was done by Five Winds International back in, as I say, in 2001 when ICMM was formed. And it began to look at what's the value, what's really going on through the mining and metals production process. You take a resource that has a particular value to society in terms of an ore, a metal ore, mineral ore, probably not so much value in that. Through an process of investment, of mining, of refining, of producing a metal, you end up at a level where you have a material that has some sort of value to society, has a residual value. And then further investment in processing, turning that into products that are useful to society, increases their value further. The value of those products at some stage will probably drop off as the products become obsolete, as nobody uses them. But then hopefully what we see is a cycling of the material through subsequent product cycles. So this is the ideal scenario for us, for a metal, and that's really where the value lies and what the investment of the industry is doing to place those into the market. If we compare that with a different material, you can see this sort of leads us to see where the difference in strategies for managing the resource are. This is for wood and paper, so fibrous materials. You see the same thing again. You have a resource base, this time probably a much higher value to society already as a resource base. Forests are vital for the planet. But again, by investing in an industry that takes that, turns it into a material, into timber, into paper, and then processes it into products, you see these subsequent steps in value. And again, you can cycle that through to various product loops through recycling, getting that material back and recycling it. The big difference that you see in the case of something like this for fibrous materials is that recycling loops tend to degrade the property of the materials. So you tend to find that after multiple recycling loops with paper products, wood products, you can't get back to as high a value product as you started with. So it leads you to a stage where you're going into lower and lower value products, and very often the final step there is burning for energy recovery, or very nicely what we're seeing more these days is using them as insulation or something along those lines. So a kind of double win from a carbon perspective there. But it means that as this is a renewable resource, the obvious resource and the obvious sort of stewardship strategy is to maintain the integrity of that resource. So forest stewardship, in other words, that's why the whole process, the whole sort of theme of forest stewardship for wood, for timber, is the main stewardship strategy. Going back to the metals one, for us, really the key is in maximising the utility of that metal element. So making sure that when we've done the mining, at this stage down here, the mining, that has to be done as responsibly as we can, minimise impacts through that, manage the burdens that are associated with mining. But then in the product side, the key factor that we think is really central is making sure that you can keep using the metals. So when it goes into products, it needs to be designed in a way that it can be recovered or be reused, recycled. And in the ideal, this system would just go on and on. So that's where our terminology for materials stewardship came from. We wanted the mining companies to start thinking about this a little bit more. How can they engage in this kind of activity? What expertise do we have? What information do we have that'll allow others further downstream to make more informed decisions about the way that they're using metals and making sure that the materials they're producing from them maximise the attributes of the metals themselves. The supply chain itself, sort of drawn out here in the typical fashion, sort of immediately shows some clues as to why it's difficult to have this sort of a joined up process between certain ends. Each of these steps on this diagram, for example, is probably undertaken by a different entity, a different company, maybe somewhere different in the world, and you see the sort of process stewardship product stewardship side of things that we understand are all part of materials stewardship. But we see that depending on where you are in this cycle, you're going to have lesser or greater ability to actually act and to influence. So mining companies sitting over here somewhere can do good work around mining, around process improvements, maybe working with the people they're selling materials to. But then it's a case of really trying to figure out what can they do that's smart in the rest of this supply chain. How can we partner with others? How can we make sure that any information we develop flows through the supply chains? And that's been at the heart of what we're trying to do in the Material Stewardship Programme. Just to illustrate the challenge, these are our mining companies, and you can see how far their activities extend through the value chain. So the majority of our members produce refined metals of some sort. This is probably concentrates, first refined products. Others go on to produce semi-fabricated products. Very few are actually producing consumer products these days. So I get back to the point I said earlier about the industry being less vertically integrated than it used to be. Many of these companies in the past you would have associated with finished products, but not anymore. Only a certain number do. So we're at a part of the materials cycle where we can control what we do at the site. Beyond that, it's really about influence. We're trying to engage with policymakers, trying to engage with customers, engage with those people using the materials and the people regulating them to make sure that they're used in the best possible way. And that's at the heart of material stewardship. So in the early days, our CEOs sort of agreed that there is a sense of shared responsibility for the materials that we create. And that's really what's at the heart of material stewardship. So in practice, what can a mining company do? What do we promote? What sort of behaviours do we try and encourage within our member companies? We released, working again with Five Winds International actually, a guidance document called Maximising Value in 2006, and that was really the beginning of material stewardship for ICMM. And it encourages three behaviours, largely speaking. The first being to understand the materials they're producing. So look at the materials themselves. What are the social, what are the environmental impacts, burdens, what are the benefits of those materials? Not just digging the things out of the ground and selling them on. This needs to be done for regulatory compliance in some cases. In other cases it doesn't. But it's a good thing for companies to be doing. And mining companies are actually reasonably good at doing this in terms of investing in life cycle data on the products they're investigating and looking at the chemical properties of them, the burdens throughout, the impacts through the life cycle. But then when that's done, the companies really need relationships along the supply chain to transfer that information, but also to find out what other people need to know about the materials. What properties do you need information on? How can you best use the materials? And when you have that understanding and you have the relationships, then the third part, taking action on stewardship, start to come into play. So you start to find that companies will see opportunities to do things, quite novel things. And process efficiency is something that mining companies can generally do in isolation. They're working towards that on their own. You start to see other things. Companies, for example, realising there are opportunities in recycling or in buyback schemes through people who are using products. And so just having these relationships along the supply chain starts to open up opportunities, and it starts to take away the linear nature of that supply chain a little bit. Puts the mining companies in a position where they can interact further along the value chain. Of course, this also has direct benefits for the mining companies. These sort of schemes, material stewardship type schemes, to encourage people to take them up, there has to be a benefit of these. And so some of the benefits that you'll see our companies, I think, are benefiting from in terms of implementing material stewardship, these sort of things. It helps them meet public commitments, clearly. But access to market, reputational capital from these kind of activities is great. The access to market issue is a really good one. If you can't access a market because you've been regulated out of it, then there's no point in digging the material out of the ground in the first place. So making sure that the industry is better connected to the value chains, the supply chains that it's serving is really fundamental to what we're doing. And we're making some progress in this. And if you look at, again, you can go to our website and you'll see much of the information is there to download the projects that we've undertaken in the past. One big part of our program has been on looking at, there have been two aspects of the material stewardship program to date over the last few years. The first has been looking at sustainable consumption and production policies. And we've been trying to partner with some of the big institutes looking at those. We work a lot with OECD, with UNEP, with other institutes to look at what's going on in the world of sustainable consumption and production. How can we translate that back to the activities of our members? And in fact, how can we use what we know about metals to help shape some of those policies? It's not always the case that one policy will work well for all materials. So how can we make sure that the realities of our industry are reflected? That's taken us into as I say, areas like recycling, like life cycle impact assessment, like eco-efficiency, and issuing some guidance for our members, but also being actively involved in policy debates on that, which I think is important. The second area that we've been engaged in very actively over the last decade is in chemicals management, and it's really a subset of sustainable consumption and production. It's about assessing and managing responsibly the chemicals risks from materials. So this could be risks to the environment, risks to human health. It could be at a mine site, could be through use of a product in society. So through the whole life cycle. There's been a real change in the attitude to that. It's been afforded a great priority globally over the last decade. In Europe, there's been a regulation called REACH that many of you interested in environmental affairs might be aware of, but it's really reversed the burden of proof that the industry has to put things onto the market. So a company that wants to put a material on the market now has to develop the data to prove that there aren't impacts from that material, that it's safe to market. And it's absolutely the right mindset to go into, but it's taken a lot of development of science, a lot of data development. The challenge for the mining, the metals industry, and the metals industry, I guess, largely, is that methodologies and assessment around chemical effects would develop mostly for organic chemicals, for PCBs, for dioxins, some of the big sort of headline issues back in the 1970s, and regulatory systems were developed around those materials rather than minerals and metals. So part of what we've done in collaboration with the commodity associations and a lot of the leading academics and regulators is rewrite those regulations to tailor them for minerals and metals, so that the properties that you need to have to make sure that you're making a good assessment of the risks of a metal are included in a regulation. So that would then apply from maybe permitting at a mine site right the way through to something like the Water Framework Directive in Europe, looking at our waters and the amounts of the levels of metal that are permissible in them. So getting that science right in the regulations has been a real big focus of what ICMM's done in the Material Stewardship Programme. And I think it's a very nice example of where mining companies are working well with the metals companies and others further down the value chain to make sure that they're solving a problem. So that's a little bit about what we're doing in terms of materials stewardship. So a very quick overview of why we're doing what we're doing and some of the main activities. And I wanted to sort of move into the final section here on some of the new things that we're seeing, some of the trends, some of the drivers, and perhaps I think we're probably on the cusp of seeing a sort of a real change in speed, if not direction, in this area. I think there's been a very significant difference as well in the communities that are interested in this whole area of resource efficiency, responsible provision of materials. Until now, we've been talking largely to the industry, to policymakers, to research institutes. That's where the interest has really lain for the last decade or so. What we're seeing now, I think, is a change to a much more of a consumer-driven, customer-driven concerns. People wanting assurance that the products they're buying contain materials that have been produced responsibly. And the conflict minerals one is obviously a real highlight issue. It's the one that most people will be aware of. But we're seeing an awful lot of this emerging elsewhere. These sort of circles around the outside of the sort of things that we're seeing within the metals industry at the moment. It's a bit of a messy diagram, I'm afraid. But what I've tried to do is sort of group them into three areas that I hope will make some sense as I go through them. There's a lot of overlap between this. A lot of these things are responding to the same issues, but hopefully there'll be some sense to this as I go through it. But the first thing that we're seeing is a great development in what we're calling supply chain sustainability initiatives or responsible sourcing schemes. These kind of schemes that are, as I say, driven by consumers wanting to know what's in the products they're buying. And in many cases, these schemes are actually driven by the manufacturers towards the end of the supply chain. It's very brand oriented, very focused on protecting brands, making sure that risks throughout the supply chain are managed well. So it's no longer a case for somebody producing the raw material that they just sell it into a market, into an exchange, and it makes its way off and they don't know what happens to it. People want to know coming in the other direction. Exactly where those materials have come from, what are the burdens associated with them from an environmental standpoint, from a human health standpoint, maybe a human rights issue. Was there slave labour, child labour involved in the extraction of that material? And this is something that we're seeing hugely spilling over into the mining and metals industry. It's been there for a good while, I think, in other industries. We probably first saw it with things like fur in the fashion industry, then into agricultural goods and food. People being much more interested in those products. But we are seeing a lot of initiatives now around this sort of traceability, responsible sourcing dimension within the mining and metals industry. It's fairly multifaceted. It's coming across most sectors. Some sectors are ahead of others in how they've had to when and how they've been tackling this. I think when you look at this sort of range of issues in increasing complexity at the right-hand side here, from simply having a system that could track performance of a material right through to traceability of a material from the site of production through to a product and everything that goes in between. We're certainly beginning to see most sectors moving along that curve in terms of the questions that they're asking of the initial producers of materials. Jewellery is probably the one that was there first. It's probably a product it's a high-value product, a product that carries an emotional connection as well, I guess, in many respects. And you see schemes that are well established in the jewellery sector. So, for example, a couple of our mining company members, Rio Tinto and Newmont, have been working for quite some while now with Walmart and to supply gold and silver for a particular range of jewellery that they have called Love Earth. And the idea being that whoever's buying that connection has assurance that those metals have come from a mine that's operating to all the latest standards environmentally and socially. So there's so much more of that happening. There's much more awareness of the materials, where they're coming from, and as I said, you're seeing it in most sectors to a degree, and it's certainly becoming more complex and evolving over time. An example from within the building and construction sector, so it's not just a niche sector. They're getting a lot of questions from customers, from clients within the building sector to see where their materials are coming from. The big question for them maybe 5 years ago was starting to be around carbon footprint and embodied carbon. It's now starting to be more about actual sourcing, provenance of materials. And you can see that there's a wide range of sort of constituencies that they're responding to on this as well. Not just the consumers or the public or activists. Governments are now a major stakeholder in this. I mean, responding to, I guess, that sort of overall trend. We're seeing more and more regulation around this, more codes for sustainable practice that materials are having to comply with, and where they came from, how they were produced is all part of that. And I think it'll keep accelerating. We're seeing some huge changes. We're seeing it all the time. Companies are getting more and more requests about this. There are more systems being set up. It's becoming more complex. And I think there's a real commercial driver for it. It's becoming a differentiation aspect in the market. Interestingly, not many people will pay a premium for a product that's been responsibly sourced, but they like them. It's a brand insurance, if you like, for many of those people putting products into the market now. They need that stamp that says it's been assured. So it's a forest stewardship stamp, or it's been responsibly, it's a rainforest alliance stamp. You're seeing all these systems emerging. So far, you don't really see that for minerals and metals. You can't really go to a market and buy a responsibly sourced ingot of something. It takes a bit of work. It can be done in niche cases at the moment, but that's the area where I think we're moving, and it's going to need some changes in practice. It's going to need traceability through the supply chains. It's going to need agreed code of conduct. I'll come back to that in a second. Another area where I think we can learn a lot is actually looking at conflict minerals. This was possibly the most high-profile example of this phenomenon, but I'm sure you're all familiar with the background to conflict minerals, so I won't spend a long time on it. But really, it was looking at the sourcing of tin, tungsten, and tantalum from the DRC, where the mining and production of those materials was funding rebel conflict, and a lot of these metals are going into high-value consumer goods that people, again, are very attached to. People don't want these goods associated with human rights abuses, with conflict in another part of the world. So very quickly, this issue spread globally. It led quite quickly to supply chains reacting. The industry reacted, put into place some traceability schemes, ways of assuring that materials weren't coming from conflict zones. It also led to the likes of the OECD producing guidance on how to perform due diligence on supply chains. And again, this is at an extreme. It's gone. There is regulation around conflict minerals now. The Dodd-Frank Act in the US, the involving supply chain conflict minerals regulations in the EU, which are under consultation at the moment, similar sort of provisions, which are all going to require companies to declare in some way that they're putting in place systems of diligence to make sure they're not sourcing conflict minerals. So we can actually see quite a lot. This has gone all the way through to being a regulation that companies have to deal with. But you can see that through the systems that have been developed to respond to this, it can be done. So there is now sort of, in a way, traceability in that you can say that's coming from a conflict region or isn't coming from a conflict region, and that's happening on a global scale. So finally, the final section I just wanted to talk about was what does this mean for us as an extractive sector? What does it mean for that mining company that's sitting at the very beginning of the supply chain, and what do we need to do? How do we react to this call for more information, this interest from our customers, from their customers, in how materials are being produced? We know that there's not a great reputation for the mining industry. It's improving, but there are areas where perception can be improved. How do we somehow, when companies are doing a lot of good work to improve practices around mining and mine materials responsibly, how do we make sure that is reflected along the supply chain? Would be the question that our member companies would be asking, certainly. But how do you do it on a bigger level? I think some of the things we're going to need are, responsible practice in material stewardship. I think more widespread sort of stewardship schemes, making sure that the extractors, that everybody along the value chain is bought into these schemes is vital. That there's a sort of high level agreement on principles, on what they're doing, and bringing people together through the value chain. Common codes of practice are going to be essential as well. People are going to want to agree on the standards that they want to see for a particular material, and that might be specific to a certain material. It might respond to hotspots in the production of a particular material, but people are going to want to see that common codes of practice relating to aspects of of extraction, aspects of processing, maybe even transport, going along the whole value chain. And then traceability of material flows is something that would open up, I think, huge opportunities. At the moment, it's quite difficult to trace metals because of the way that the value chains operate. That metal supply chains can be reasonably opaque. And in fact, they've evolved to be opaque because there are people within the supply chains that trade on opacity. You don't want to be able to trace something, see where you don't want your competitors to know where you're getting it from at a particular price. That's been the sort of mindset in the past. Actually, we're going to have to somehow work around those things to create more transparency along value chains, but at the same time being able to protect information that is confidential, is business sensitive information. So that's going to be a real challenge, I think. Can it be done? I'm sure it can be done. It's done when it needs to be done on a small scale and niche scale. I think transferring that to a large scale is a real challenge for our sector, and it's something that I don't think is going to be particularly easy, but I think it's not impossible. And then effective communication along the supply chains. I think at the moment that's one of the big barriers with that sort of silo mentality along the supply chain. Information doesn't flow well along the supply chains, and we've seen that in the few initiatives that are being set up in the mining and metals sector. That's often one of the barriers to improving this sort of performance of the whole materials cycle, is that information gets stuck in the part of the cycle where it's generated. So these are all things I think that need to be worked on. But the issues, we know what the issues are, and these are the sort of summary of some of the requests that ICMM members get from their customers, asking about systems around these factors on the left. So the things you'd expect to see: labour, socio-economic impacts, product responsibility. These are the things that our direct customers are asking us about. They're probably the same things that their customers are asking them about. So I think that the concerns are shared across the supply chain, so there's scope to really improve this. This is one of the most recent pieces of work that we've been doing. We recognise that there's this real proliferation in supply chain initiatives. So you have, as I mentioned, your forest stewardship. You have for timber, there's the bond sucrose scheme for sugars. There's a responsible palm oil system. There's soy. There's teas. There's a whole number of these out there now. A few in our sector. There's an aluminium stewardship initiative which is just beginning. Well, it's actually evolving quite well. So we began to look at those and say, well, what are the common elements of them? what challenges were they responding to, how have they gone about it, and can we learn lessons for the mining metals industry, particularly from some of these schemes that have been in sectors that are a little bit further down the road than us, particularly the agricultural sector. So we commissioned a report, a Track Record Global undertook this for us over the past few months, and these are some of the studies, some of the conclusions, and I'm not going to go into these in too many details, but essentially it's very interesting to look at what schemes exist, and they all exist for their own purposes. I think that's the thing we start to see. They're responding to different requests for information, different sensitivities. The drivers are all slightly different, but you do see some commonalities. There needs to be a clear clarity of purpose with these schemes. There needs to be commercial buy-in. These things have to support themselves in some ways. So we're beginning to learn some lessons about how we can put together a framework, perhaps, within ICMM for responsible supply of materials. So that we're hoping that by looking at some of the lessons from some of these other schemes, that what we can do, at least with working with our members, who are the mining companies at the one end of the scale of the chain, is to figure out what information is likely to be needed through the supply chain to be able to talk to those others, and then make sure we are generating that information and that we're producing it and communicating it in a form that's going to be useful through the value chain. So that's getting towards the end of what I wanted to say. My final slide is just a sort of note about the pace of change in this field. The way that data can be collected, aggregated, communicated is changing like never before. It's still evolving at an incredible rate, and it's meaning that information can travel along supply chains very quickly. Information, and it's really the consumer end of the supply chain that's embraced this kind of technology and information gathering and aggregating at the moment. And you see now a lot of things around like this, comparing goods, comparing services, environmental, social credentials. This is just one of the websites. You go on here, there's over 100,000 products compared. They have toxicologists, life cycle specialists working to look at what goes into making these things up. And this is all a million miles away from where the mining industry has been operating. So we need to move closer. We know that the information flows is travelling much faster. And we know that the people who are using minerals and metals are much more aware now of where they came from. And I think that's the big change that we've seen. So over the past decade, we were used to people protesting outside mines, stakeholders and local communities setting up protests outside a mine. What you didn't see before was them standing outside the Apple store or standing outside Tiffany's, and that's a real profound change. And it's that I think is changing the challenge. It's making sure that the improvements in performance that we're making, and that we definitely are making those improvements at the mining side, are somehow communicated along the value chain, so that the information that we're generating, the work that we're doing, going in one direction, doesn't sort of miss this wave of requests for information and interest in the materials that's coming in the other way in the value chain, and just making sure that we don't lose it all in a gap somewhere in the middle. So that's roughly what we're working on at ICMM. A few of my conclusions. Well, our members are committed to the issue of sustainable development. I think all aspects around mining, environment, social, economic issues, and you'll see that, I think, if you're able to have a look on the ICMM website and look at some of the work we're undertaking. I think over the past decade, as I said, the perception of the industry has improved. There is a lot still to be done. I think this fact that conflict is suddenly rising again around mining is really serious. So there's there is a disconnect between the industry and the communities that surround it. The mining industry has recognised a shared responsibility for the value chain, the full value chain of minerals and metals. And I think that the real challenge is how we engage with that. How do we make sure that we align the thinking in the mining companies with those further downstream? How do we make sure information is channeled along the supply chains? How do we build the right relationships to do that? So that's really what I wanted to say. I hope it's been an insight into what we're doing and to some of the trends we're seeing. And I'm very, very happy to take some questions.
That was indeed quite interesting. I was probably most fascinated by this statement made more than 10 years ago about the little connection between production and use of the materials. And now this new concept of material stewardship that needs to bring together the actors along the value chain. And I guess this is probably where I could tell much more about how this exactly works, and I could also imagine that this is part of the question. The floor is now open for any question, for any statement you may have. Ben is here, so please just raise your hand and say who you are and where you come from, and then go ahead.
Good evening. Hi. My name is Michelle Whitten. I'm in the Compliance Department at Eurasian Natural Resources Corp. Ben, thanks very much for your presentation. It was fascinating. I wanted to ask, you mentioned about ICMM's work on the framework for responsible supply, learning from our other schemes. Are the results of that still available yet, or is it in process?
It's still in process, actually. It's just we're just awaiting a final report. So I'm hoping that this will be something that we will share.
Do you think later this
Later
year?
this year we'll certainly have something. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, we'll have something this year. And so I think the report that I showed there, whether that will be combined with the other things that we've done in the last few years, as I say, to produce something for our members. I think it's going to be, my idea at the moment is it'll be a guidance around how we take the material stewardship concept that we've sort of coalesced around and use that to respond to this sort of new phenomenon that we're seeing of responsible sourcing. And I think it's really that. How do we align, how do we make sure that the things that the companies have done to satisfy, to a large extent, concerns at the mining end, so that the concerns that socially responsible investors have, the concerns that local communities and stakeholder groups have. How do we somehow translate that into something that goes through the value chain as well? I think that's the thing. You can't put a stamp on the metal as it goes out the gate and hope that gets through to the end of the supply chain. But it's a way, a sort of systems approach, I guess, to try to do that, and that's what we'll be working towards.
Thanks, Ben. That was great. I'm Paul Eakins. I'm Director of the ISR here at UCL. I've got lots of questions, but I'm sure that we'll allow me to ask more than one, unless everyone else is shy.
Choose the easiest.
And it's on this material stewardship stuff.
Yep.
A very quick story. When I was on the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, we were doing a report on novel materials. I wanted to push the extended producer responsibility idea, which you've mentioned a couple of times, into that report. We got in one of the big manufacturers of mobile phones, which we knew were full of relatively novel materials. Some of them elemental, some of them composites and all that. And then my entire idea fell flat on its face because this producer of mobile phones had no idea what was in the mobile phone. Kind of 40 elements maybe were in there somewhere, but they had no idea how much or in which components they were. What we also now know is that the recycling of those kinds of elements in mobile phones is less than 1% in the majority of cases, and that's a report that's come out from the International Resource Panel recently. And the kinds of ideas that are being pushed through to try to remedy those situations are extended producer responsibility and traceability through something like a product passport, which was one of the recommendations of the European Resource Efficiency Platform coming out recently. Now, knowing the complexity of these supply chains, that's a mind-boggling thought that from your members and their ingots, you're going to go all the way up that supply chain, could be hundreds of different companies in different countries, creating finally the component that goes in the mobile phone, which might have fractions of a milligram of a particular metal. Can you imagine that happening, and what are the sorts of public policy processes that might encourage it?
It's a very good question, and I agree. It's in those examples, it's difficult to imagine. It's very difficult to imagine. I think there are some even simpler ones where, through this last study, we've seen some good examples of. There are very different uses of metals, clearly, and those tiny fractions of metals that are going into these small devices are a really interesting one. We looked at what's the feasibility of doing this for something like steel. And it's really interesting because it differs hugely. If you look at the alloying elements that go into steel, for iron, you could probably do it. Suddenly you start to look at tiny, percentage amounts of molybdenum you're putting in there, which is produced as a byproduct of mining copper somewhere else in the world. And those challenges exist on all levels, and it's going to be very difficult. I think traceability is going to be is the nut to crack with a lot of this. And I think that if you could somehow physically trace the metal and have the systems to do that, it would be a big help, because a lot of the schemes that work at the moment, and this is not just true in the mining sector. This is true in some of the other schemes that work. The palm oils, the soys, the teas, these kind of things. Very few of them have physical traceability of product. They work on some kind of mass balance system. So you put a particular percentage of responsibly sourced material into a system, you can take that much out in credits, and so that's how a lot of these systems work at the moment. And I imagine that when we move to systems in the metals industry, that's how it will work, and at least initially, because there's a driver to do. I think there's a real driver to have that sort of thing at the moment. I think that would help satisfy a lot of the concerns. I suspect the actual physical traceability would be that next step, but it would be very interesting to have that, because it could change the whole model of what you do with metals. You maybe move to a system then where you can lease metals rather than sell them. They go into, and I know a lot of the sort of high-tech materials companies are looking at this concept where you're selling almost the way that they're saying, you're selling the performance of the material rather than the material itself. So it goes to the manufacturers with they have this kind of credit note when they bring it back, and but I think its traceability is going to be the one thing that's going to be quite difficult. How do you differentiate between that material that's coming from a good performer in the mining sector from a bad performer? I guess that's one of the policy areas that will help, that differentiation. I mean, differentiation is good for ICMM members. If we could differentiate between the good performers and bad performers in the mining industry, that's great. I mean, in a way, that's never an ideal. It's sort of a selective sustainability. What you really want to do is get everybody performing better. But yeah, it's one sort of policy angle that could be looked at, I think.
I look from PE International. We work with also 5 Winds as part of us.
Yep.
So we work with obviously a huge number of mining and metals companies. I think one of the interesting challenges which we often come across, and I'm sure you do as well, Ben, is that you have an awful lot of environmental and sustainability people who talk to each other very well, but there's sometimes a disconnect with the rest of the organisation. So to give you a good example, we were recently we managed to get an OEM and a metals company talking to each other, and then the whole thing was almost scuppered halfway through this exercise of trying to sort of reach a bit more vertical alignment, because it turned out that the product designers had designed out the metal in the next generation of products because of some concerns they had about it. And they had absolutely no idea that there were these initiatives going on that were going to hopefully address some of those concerns. So they were feeling one pressure, which was the NGO stakeholder, the environmental people were working very well together, but they'd sort of forgotten to tell the product designers and the rest of the organisation what's going on.
Yeah.
How do you? I mean, we try and sort of we have ideas amongst ourselves about how you can try and do that, but it often comes right at the end, the communication across the rest of the organisation. How do you manage that process over some of these initiatives? You talk about the ASI. The ASI is I think, progressing very quickly. Yeah. It's going to take 2-3 years for that to even reach probably a pilot testing stage.
Yeah. No, it's a challenge in all of these aspects of that we work on. The people who work on the issues, as you say, are very committed. They work within one part of a company, and getting that stuff. Sustainability is reasonably moving into the mainstream, I think, of a lot of companies. I think there's a serious commitment from the extractive companies to align their policies. But it's the detail, unfortunately, and it gets to the stage where it's detail that people need to know, and it's a really good example of designing out the benefits of something because of concerns around a potential impact. And we've seen the same thing recently. We have within companies very, very good experts sit in a particular department and suddenly with metals, I think this is a really interesting sort of observation that we made in the last year or so, is that we talk a lot to the sustainability groups within a mining company. There'll be EHS, so the environmental health and safety people, there's life cycle people, people who know the materials properties inside out. And suddenly, actually the important people on many of the issues we're working on, which I've been working a lot in the last year on marine transport issues, actually it's the sales people are actually the ones who are hit by the regulations and are finding ways to work around it. And it's really interesting that actually in the past it's maybe there are not strong enough links certainly between the commercial side of businesses and that sustainability side. And I think the same when you get to the manufacturing industries. Yeah, the same is true with the designers, and that whole design for environment recycling. It's vital, particularly for metals, because you need to get them back out of that product at the end of its life as well. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge that we face. I imagine it's a challenge that every part of the supply chain is facing within their own companies, and it's something that really will have to be sorted out. It can be very acute on particular subjects.
Okay.
Mine's Ben Armstrong. You interestingly noted the issue of access to finance as a key driver for some of your companies, and of course a lot of financial institutions are somewhat concerned about their own reputations. But fundamentally in commodities, the global market is driven by rapid decisions over massive commodity deals which take place in a second via the internet with no due diligence about where the material came from. I'm not that there's particular metal.
No.
That's the way it happens, and that seems to me to be a fundamental push of the global supply chain.
Yeah.
That you're always going to have a problem resolving until the people providing the money which facilitates that have some responsibility for the due diligence process.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge challenge with the way that metals are traded, the way that they go from that bit in between the sort of mining, processing, and then the market side.
Well, at the front you can do the front end.
Yeah.
And the consumers can do what they can do at the other end.
Yeah.
The reality is the market doesn't allow the very tracing that
you're
saying.
It's an interesting debate actually, because this has long been put forward as one of the big arguments why traceability won't happen. Interestingly, we've found through talking to the traders, they can do it, because the one thing that people want is assurance of the quality of the material. So if you're buying 99.9999% copper, you want to know it is that. If you go back to, if you find you've bought something from an LME warehouse that isn't that, the LME needs to go back to the producer and say, you've sold us a dud. And it turns out that actually that sort of system isn't enacted very often, but warehouses generally can trace things because they do it from a quality perspective. It turns out that these concerns around quality very rarely actually materialise. But through some of the discussions we've had recently, we found that actually those things might not be as difficult as we first thought. There are other challenges though of a very similar nature. The way that contracts are swapped, the way that things are blended. A ship going to one part of the world might suddenly be sold to another company that can take a similar material off a ship that's nearer to them. These sort of strange things that happen in supply chains that they're not insurmountable problems. But you can have an audit trail to track them, but it's certainly difficult. And the trading, the way that the metals are traded, the sort of warehouse systems are. Yeah, that's one of the difficult areas, and it's not a particularly transparent area at the moment. So work to be done for sure.
I have a question myself. My question is related to the material stewardship idea and the materials or the categories. I realize there is a lot of talk about the conflict materials, which are usually very small in quantities, and also when you look at what their potential impact is on sustainable development, both in the more problematic part or in the more beneficial part, it's rather tiny because of the low qualities that are traded. At the same time, the traceability challenges are huge. So the question would be, from my perspective, why should one start with those materials, and wouldn't it be easier in a way to address the materials where you have a bigger bulk, a bigger chunk, like aluminium, where the bauxite mining has by far a bigger impact on countries, on environments, on all regards of sustainability. The traceability is much easier because aluminium is different to other materials, not within the materials. It's quite within the product. It's quite often it's like the auto part. Like when you look at the fancy Apple product, so you realize as a consumer this is aluminium. It also is quite often in construction. It is an automotive production. So you would have more integrated value chains that could deal with larger corporations like automotive corporation. At the same time, the recycling rate is shockingly low. So it might be easier to start a material stewardship project with materials that are better integrated rather than the contact materials.
No, it's a good point. I think that the progress that's been made on conflict minerals first is just because it was because of the sort of emotional connection to the issue, and the fact that it was a very high-profile issue. It was the media issue. It was something that became regulated very quickly, in fact. But I think it's a good contrast with aluminium, because I think the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative is making progress very quickly because of those factors. You know, aluminium mining, the industry generally it's compared to others, it's a small number of very large mines. You see quite a lot of transparency in the way that it's transported, traded, and again, you remember that the pressure on that only really came into action once there was a consumer pushing for it. So in that case, it was Nespresso looking at the coffee capsules and realizing that they were actually getting a lot of stick for using aluminium in the first place for a fairly low value product that potentially wasn't the best use of the material. They responded by putting a recycling scheme in place, which was a good move forward. That's exactly what needed to be done. But then they were hit again with more concerns over, actually you're recycling, but where are you getting the aluminium from in the first place? And that was the sort of seed that led to the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. And it's that sometimes it needs that pull. That's what we see, I think, with a lot of those sustainability initiatives, is that they are brand driven in some way. But it's that thinking that I think needs to change. The producer sectors need to be much more active in developing the materials, developing the information. The information's there, I think. I think with the information to a great extent has been developed to satisfy the needs for the socially responsible investment communities, for other stakeholders. It's just that we don't associate sometimes that same information with the product. And aluminium, it's good to see what's happening with the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, and I'd encourage you to have a look at the website, ASI website. It's very interesting, actually. And you'll see that since starting off with a niche product in terms of Nespresso, you've now got some major construction companies. You've got the brand car manufacturers in there, all working together, and two of our companies, Hydro and Rio Tinto, are involved in that. So it's very interesting to see.
Yeah, the reputation issue probably is important of companies such as Nespresso.
Well,
You may have started to answer the question. Do you have some practical examples where your members have embraced the circular economy?
Yeah, we do have some issues, and actually some of them, if you that online material stewardship toolkit that I talked about has a lot of case studies in there, but you see some nice examples around. I mean, the interesting thing with circular economy is always scale, and I mean, what scale do you look at it at? But we do start to see things where companies are taking back consumer goods and using their primary smelting facilities, for example. I mean, it's a very simple scheme. One of the companies doing this, Tech Metals in Canada, is taking back obsolete cathode ray screens, has been doing this for the last decade, and putting them back into their smelter, these sort of things. It's a feedstock for them. It's solving a problem of dealing with waste and disposal of those. We start to see the same sort of things. I mean, you see these little sort of loops forming in terms of process as well. Mill liners for mining equipment, that sort of thing. Companies being set up that will reuse components, refurbish them, sell them back to mining companies. On that scale, I think things work really well. On a larger scale, it's hard to know. I think the challenges, I think, for metals in the circular economy are well known. I think it varies depending on products, depending on materials, and metals tend to be in use for a long time, or can be. There's a huge. If it's a drinks can, it's available for recycling and reprocessing very quickly. If it's a lintel in a building, it could be in there for 100 years. So, it's unfortunately it's not a sort of one size fits all solution, but we are starting to see some nice examples on that. And I think some of the high tech metals companies are probably the places to look, particularly towards the likes of Umicore and Johnson Matthey, and the way that they're beginning to look at, as I said, that sort of whole concept of materials leasing and making sure they're getting materials back from the economy. It's moving. It's beginning to happen.
You mentioned biodiversity and offset it. Do you have any input into the sort of end of life of the mines, restoration of the environment, of that has been despoiled by?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, it is part of our environment program, and sort of mine closure and mine legacy has always been a huge issue. There was a sort of mines were in the past, mines were closed and abandoned, and companies moved on, and that's been probably one of the biggest factors in the mining industry achieving such a poor reputation in the past, has been the way that they've managed legacy sites, and the way that those things have just not really been managed properly. And we have. So we've tried to work with our companies, but also some of the sort of leading thinkers outside to look at issues of mine closure, particularly around financial planning for mine closure. That's a whole area that's evolved hugely in sort of financial provisioning for it. But we're also beginning to look this year. In fact, we have a new project on closure, and it's quite interesting. One of the challenges has been that we have some project funding to look at mine closure. The issues being it's sort of what are we going to look at? There's so many aspects of it to look at. There's a sort of technical side to it in terms of remediation, in terms of long-term control of runoff waters. The sort of how do you build tailings ponds? How do you do that sort of things? There's a sort of social side to it. There are other aspects, but yeah, it's one area that in fact in the very early days ICMM was quite active on mine closure, particularly the financial provisioning side of it. There was a bit of a lull for a few years, and now closure's sort of back onto our agenda. So I'm very pleased to see that, because, and again, it's an area where the leading companies are actually doing some very interesting work. But sadly, it is a legacy for the industry. There's an awful lot to do.
Of that and ask about mines that are sort of reopening old sites and going back to the value of the metals gone up so much. Do you find that they're coming to you for advice, or are you advising them on sustainable ways of reopening these sites and maybe managing them because they're starting again?
Interestingly, I don't think we've seen that actual scenario happening, but you're right, it is happening more and more. People are mining either old sites or old areas of current mines that they've moved on from, and a number of our members are doing this sort of thing, and it raises its own technical challenge. You start going back through old mine tailings that are relatively stable, and you're back into the same ground as you were when you were running a mine. But interesting, I don't think we've had any direct involvement with sort of new companies, but we do get a lot of small, medium-sized companies taking up the guidance that we produce. So I think some of the guidance that we produced on maybe around biodiversity, around environmental guidelines would certainly help them. No, I don't know. I can certainly go and ask our communications team and see if they see what sort of requests they get. Yeah.
It seems like such a good time to start implementing new environmental sort of procedures within their mine for every year.
Yeah. It would certainly be part of the permitting process for reopening any new mines, so that sort of the regulation of mine to become much more stringent.
Some of those sites in Eastern Europe. Some of those sites were closed in the early 90s, thought to be inefficient, commodity prices were low, and there might be some thought in these areas that this actually might be beneficial. The same happens with regard to landfills, right?
Yeah.
That landfills are also now regarded as potential mines and reopened in order to realize what sort of metals are in particular in those old landfills. So lots of interesting things going on.
There's stuff within the UK as well now.
Yeah, there's a nice the rare earths things just reminded me that there's a nice example that I'd spoken to my former in my previous life. I worked on rare earths. My PhD was looking at alloy processing, and the group that I used to work in is now looking at the problem around one of the major applications for rare earths has been in electronics, in hard drives. So that the read-write arm in a hard drive is controlled by two magnets, very small flat magnets. A few grams of rare earth go into each. But when you add that up over how many hard drives are used, all over the world, you realise there's actually a fair amount of material going into these things. But to disassemble a hard drive, to demagnetise a magnet and get it out of there is actually quite a difficult thing to do. Firstly, it's magnetic. Secondly, it's fairly reactive stuff. And it takes a lot to get the hard drive apart and do it. And very interestingly, the group that's working on the actual magnet processing, and there are various industries sponsoring it here in the UK, in fact. They're looking to see whether they say, well, actually, the processes, the process for producing rare earth magnet uses hydrogen as one of the early stages in the processing of the rare earth to crepitate the alloy. Basically, it turns it into a powder, and then you can mill that powder very finely, sinter it into the magnet. They've realised that actually, why can't they use that process to get the metals back out at the end, so that you could use the same certainly the same technology, potentially even the same facilities that you're using for processing a primary metal, a primary alloy, into magnets to then get them out of the product at the end of life. So that what they're just experimenting at the moment, pretty much chopping a hard drive in half, throwing it into this machine, and then you get the rare earths back out of it. So that's quite a nice example of that sort of circular economy thinking, that it's feedstock for them. Of course, the critical metal aspect of rare earths has become quite high profile, with 97% of production in China and export restrictions on rare earths. Being able to shore up supply through recycling is interesting. So that's leading to funding for what they're doing, and it's very interesting actually, that field, and that's one of the sort of nice little examples I've seen in the last year or so.
Yeah, it could also be one of the nice new business models, right?
Absolutely.
Because refineries cooperate much closer, or might become a holding or more integrated.
Yeah.
Quite fascinating.
Yeah.
Hi, Barbara Dishon. I have a question. I don't know, it might not be your area of expertise, maybe somebody else knows. It's looking at it from a different perspective. But for example, lots of the communities are now, with the local supply chains and things like that, are looking at putting together cooperatives and small, where they go through all the processes of the supply chain and produce, for example, fair trade gold.
Yeah.
So you have, where it comes from, all of that is in place, but then they're not managing to sell that product in London or somewhere else because those traders or buyers of metals have their own sort of clients, whatever, their places, and the supply would maybe not be the right amount or big enough for. So here you have, they've done all of that, and they've spent, I don't know how much money to get it all in place, and then that metal doesn't get sold.
Yeah.
That's the other side. So
Yeah. No, it's true, and I don't know the solution, but it just seems like a missed opportunity for the bigger companies in a way. There surely is some way that they have easy access to the markets. That you would have thought that there'd be some.
So you're saying that the bigger companies should, and that could be part of their sustainability.
Could be part of it.
Yeah. And buy that off the smaller cooperative, and then
work with them in some way to get it to the markets. I would have thought it's that sort of thing seems like there's an opportunity crying out. That's certainly one of the type of solution that's being used in some parts of the world to deal, and I don't know that example offhand, but with artisanal mining. So around gold mining in particular, artisanal and small scale mining is a huge problem for a lot of countries. And but artisanal, the estimates on the number of artisanal miners in the world are phenomenal. There are just an incredible number of artisanal miners that are earning a living through this, and it's a very difficult issue to solve because it's providing them with a wage that wouldn't be there otherwise. So the companies trying to fence off land and ban people from mining just doesn't work. We've sort of seen this, and
example of one mining company that's done the opposite.
Yeah.
It's basically accepted artisanal mines called Saints Resources.
Yes.
It's diamonds and ceramics. And they've decided to basically take that metal. I mean, they're paying obviously, so they have cash flow immediately while they're building. They didn't start with drilling. They started with the artisanal miners and the government and everybody else. And so they have 200,000 local employees. And they've embraced all of that, and they're now selling those diamonds for them.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going, and I'm saying that's been the solution to some of the ASM problems at particular sites. And I'm just thinking, you know, it resonates. It sounds like that's the same sort of issue with these people who are going a step further and maybe, you know, providing refined material. But I'm sure there'll be niches in the market for them. It's just that it's that whole problem of finding the markets. But I guess that's one area where where the revolution in communications will probably at some stage come to their assistance. And,
UCL Energy Institute. Another opportunity that seems to be crying out is renewable energy to power renewable activity, especially in copper mining, because very electricity intensive. So I just wondered if you have any input or trends on what's happening for renewable energy.
I don't, I'm afraid. It's a very simple answer. I'm really not in touch with what the companies are doing. I know that there is huge potential, you're absolutely right, and I know that companies are looking at that, particularly because of the geographical challenges of mining. You after mining in, you have to mine where the resource is, and so the renewable energy solutions I think are becoming part of the strategies, but I'm afraid it's not an area that I've been involved in. Sorry, but
a quick story. In Chile, 99.9% of the power of the energy to produce that goes to mining is coming from fossil fuel, and at the same time they have the highest solar irradiance on that. And it would cost actually at current price of solar PV, because I'm 30% to be 30% cheaper to use solar PV. And they're still not much happy.
Well, the area I guess you do see this is again is the aluminium industry, which is hugely and probably the most energy intensive in terms of refining, and you've definitely seen that move within the aluminium industry to locate to sort of follow the energy markets almost. But so you see a lot of aluminium produced from hydroelectric power, for example. So yeah, so you seeing that. I mean, that's a really interesting dynamic. That at one stage the production, the refining would have followed the resource around the world. Cheap transport in essence opens up other possibilities. So refining can follow a labour market around the world, or in the case of aluminium, could follow energy markets. So the low impact, environmental impact has certainly been attractive for aluminium refining companies, but also obviously the assurance of the power from hydroelectric power. They're not beholden to a yeah, I'm sure you're absolutely right. It's something that others will look at. I think crushing rocks accounts for somewhere in the region of 6% of the world's energy. It's a huge amount of energy that goes into the primary stages of mining. So if you can make a fraction of an improvement in efficiencies in that respect in the mining industry, you're talking about huge repercussions. So
that's probably part of the broader picture also about disruptive innovation in the mining industry, which haven't happened quite often so far, but it might happen in the past. Before we finish this part here, Ben, I would like to ask you whether you had, given your background and your experience here, 1-2 recommendations for policymakers. The reason I ask this is that we've had Janusz Potocznik here, the current Commissioner for the Environment. We are sort of collecting and thinking what policymakers eventually could do in the next years to help companies to move forward on the material stewardship idea. So what would be your ideas what policymakers either in the UK or in the European Union could do to facilitate this process?
I think that we've had a fair bit of experience working with a lot of policymakers and our programme. And I look at some of the successes, and I think particularly in the chemicals management area that I mentioned earlier on, and the area of assessing chemicals risks through the supply chains. There's been a very high degree of success there, and the policymakers have done very well. And I think that one of the things that's worked well is we've had a lot of collaboration. We've had a lot of interaction between industry. There's been a lot of openness on both sides, which there isn't. It isn't always in every case. And so I think that would be my main recommendation to policymakers would be to engage with the industry as much as they can. And quite often we find that policies that fit one material particularly well don't fit another. But because we don't have enough people around the table, or we don't have the experts from that particular sector, things are missed or assumptions are made that are not right. So I think I think a lot of the thinking in terms of materials flow policies, in terms of recycling, is becoming more complex. We're not looking at simple issues of recycled content. We're beginning to recognise that actually encouraging the end of life behaviour is what we need to do, and so I think policy is becoming more complex around these things. It's becoming much more intelligent, and I think just engaging, I think, with industry is the key. And I think industry is as much at fault as policymakers in that respect. In terms of in the long term, we need to see the importance of investing in that dialogue with policymakers.
That sounds good to me. Thanks. That's both optimistic and pragmatic. Thank you very much indeed, Ben, for coming and sharing your insights with us. And thank you all for coming and being patient with this experiment here. I notice it's still a bit chilly here. Some people also pulled over on their shoulders if they hadn't done when the meeting started. There is now some wine and nibbles served in the next room, and you are indeed all invited to join us and have a chat about whatever you like.
Okay, thank you.